In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. As I mentioned in my opening remarks today, I am just back from vacation. My husband and I went overseas to primarily visit Greece and Italy. And I have to say that top of my bucket list for as long as I can remember is to go to Athens in Greece. Now, we didn't have a lot of time in Athens, but what little time we had, we felt like we had to prioritize going to the Acropolis. The Acropolis is this rocky hill in the center of town, the center of the city, and there is this flat surface overlooking the entire city at the top of the Acropolis. And on that flat surface were built a number of edifices, mostly temples, to the ancient Greek gods, primarily among them Athena. And these edifices of marble and stone are remarkably intact 2,500 years later. And so to visit them is to have this little window into what religious and social life would have looked and felt like for the ancient Greeks. Now, as you can imagine, my husband and I were not the only ones with the brilliant idea of visiting the Acropolis this particular July day. It felt like there were about 2 million people trying to get up this path to the top of the Acropolis on this particular day. As we were being jostled in this very, very slow-moving line up the hill, somebody in front of us quipped, "Well, isn't it amazing that humanity can engineer these incredible feats of architectural wonders, but we can't engineer a line to get up the hill to see these remarkable feats of architectural wonders?" The guy had a really good point, because I really don't know how there aren't multiple medical emergencies that happen at the Acropolis on any given day, and especially on a day in July. Because the pathway is pretty rocky, pretty slippery, a little bit steep in parts. There are no guardrails, there are no handrails. It was 40-degree temperature. There was nowhere that you could buy a bottle of water, and there was nowhere that you could take shelter in a little bit of shade. And there were people of all ages and stages who were part of this mass of people trying to get to the top. There was a woman behind us who was hauling a walker up the side of this rocky hill. It felt downright kind of dangerous. Now, all of that really melts away when you get to the top and it opens up. And I would say that the primary feeling that you get right away is just this feeling of awe. Standing in the shadow of these remarkable buildings that were built by human hand and human labor so many thousands of years before the modern machinery that we take for granted. In that wonder, in that sense of awe, I really felt like what I was seeing was this three-dimensional representation of this basic religious impulse that seems to be universally baked in to our human hearts. This impulse to offer, this impulse to serve, this impulse to worship, this impulse to experience joy or experience awe and wonder. This impulse to feel as if the choices of our little lives can can be part of something so much bigger. This impulse to know at the end of the day that it's not just about me. Dan and I were reflecting afterwards about the experience. We were sitting in a cafe recovering from the heat and the climb, and we were reflecting on that sense of this religious impulse. And we noted that it wasn't just in the marble that we saw this representation of this religious impulse. It was also embodied in those crowds of people. That there was this kind of sense of being on a pilgrimage. And there was this sense that people were invested in following that impulse and experiencing what it is to feel like our lives can be part of something so much bigger. To experience that humbling of recognizing just how small our lives actually are in the expanse of time and space stretching out around us. Now, obviously, the Parthenon and the other temples at the top of the Acropolis were built to honor gods that, by and large, we don't believe in or worship today in our world. Ancient Greek religion is very different from Christianity, and by no means would I want to minimize those differences. And yet, at the same time, I think that it is very fair to say that one of the reasons why Christianity was able to connect and spread across the Roman Empire and beyond, globally, is because of how it speaks to and taps into that universal religious impulse baked into our hearts. And I think it's also fair to say that the Apostle Paul, who was one of the great evangelists of the Roman Empire, was particularly gifted at being able to lift up that religious impulse that he saw in the Romans that he met across his travels across the empire, and to invite them to follow that impulse as an invitation to draw into this deepening, intimate relationship with the God who is revealed in Jesus. Now, in our gospel passage today, we have 5 little starbursts of parables. They're all really quick. And I think that we can see and hear in these 5 little parables a both and. I think that we can hear both a naming and claiming of that universal religious impulse, as well as a specific invitation to draw closer into a relationship with the God revealed to us in Jesus. We have this parable about the pearl of immeasurable value. We have this parable about the treasure that is hidden in the field. And we have these couple of people who are able to identify these treasures and who are willing to give up absolutely everything that they have in order to have these treasures for themselves. I think that we can hear in these 2 parables that articulation of that seeking, searching impulse on our human hearts, that impulse to offer and serve, that impulse to feel like we can give our lives to something bigger than ourselves. And we hear an affirmation that it's worth it. That giving our lives wholeheartedly and single-mindedly in order to know and love God is worth it. We have these also related parables about the mustard seed and the yeast. These teeny tiny little elements, the seed and the flecks of yeast. And in and of themselves, they look like they couldn't possibly be of any consequence to anyone. And yet They can grow and manifest into these things that offer shelter and sustenance and flavor and joy. And maybe we can hear in these parables an invitation to know that our little minuscule lives can also be part of something so much greater than ourselves, so much greater than the sum of our parts. We have this parable about judgment, about the good and the bad fish all being gathered together and then sorted out. And I think that we have to name judgment as part of that basic universal religious impulse as well. That impulse to know that our choices matter, that there is good and there is evil, and that aligning our lives, seeking to align our lives with good, matters in a consequential way. Now, at the same time that we lift up in these parables these more universal religious principles, we also very much have to hear these parables through the witness of Jesus, through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. The mustard seed and the yeast doesn't just describe our little lives. The mustard seed and the yeast can also very much be heard as describing how God is active in our lives and in the world around us, how God's presence and activity is shot through every aspect of our lives and of the world around us. And yet how God's activity can sometimes be on the move in us in ways that are small and harder to detect. And so we have to be attentive. We have to get good at being able to see the small and incredible ways that God is moving in our lives and shepherding us in the ways of shelter and nourishment and sustenance and flavor and joy. We can hear this parable about judgment, of the sorting of the fish. And we have to hear that parable in terms of how God's judgment is revealed in Jesus. Which is to say that it's not about God simply taking out the trash on a day of judgment. That God is actively and intentionally and always at work, overcoming the things that divide us from the love of God. Overcoming those chasms that separate us from knowing and loving God. That God is always at work drawing us back into God's own life. And that God is always at work drawing out the good. That each of our lives are in fact a mix of the good and the bad. That all around us is a mix of the good and the bad, and God is actively at work drawing out the good and leading us in that long arc of gathering us up and all of creation into the life of God, into the kingdom of heaven. Those parables about the treasure, they can be heard as an invitation for us to seek and serve God with everything that we have. But those parables, in the context of Jesus' life, can also be heard as the revelation of how God seeks and serves us, how God identifies us, each of our own individual lives, as that treasure of immeasurable worth. And God is willing to pour out everything and give everything and put everything on the line in order to reach out to us and to claim us as the treasure that God knows us to be. Dan and I kept coming back to a question as our trip went on, as we saw more and more incredible religious edifices, both of a Christian and of a pagan background across Italy and Greece. we kept asking ourselves, what happens to that religious impulse when it has nowhere to go? What happens to that religious impulse in our increasingly secular world? I was reading an article yesterday. It was an article that has studied the millions of Americans specifically who have walked away from organized religion over the past 10 or 20 years. Millions. And what the study found is that mostly people didn't walk away from organized religion because their beliefs changed or because they were mad at the church. Mostly they drifted away because modern secular life is just not set up to prioritize religious life. Here's a little quote from this article. Contemporary America simply isn't set up to promote mutuality, care, or common life. Rather, it is designed to maximize individual accomplishment as defined by professional and financial success. What happens when we're not taught how to offer? When we're not taught how to serve? When we're not taught how to experience joy, awe, and wonder? When we're not taught how our lives can be part of something bigger than just ourselves? When we're not taught that at the end of the day, it's not just all about me? And then the flip side of those questions is this question for us here today. What pearl of immeasurable value do we have in being able to be part of this common life of faith together? How fortunate are we that the mustard seeds of our little lives all get gathered up. And in that offering, that we're part of a church that's able to feed and to shelter and to serve, that's able to construct this beautiful, holy place of prayer, that's able to open our doors and hold one another in the lives of prayer and worship and service. How fortunate are we that we get to follow that religious impulse together. And together we get to follow that religious impulse into knowing deeply and intimately the life of God as revealed to us in Jesus, and to experience our lives gathered into the reign of God's kingdom. Amen.